So it's our great pleasure now to welcome Ekow Eshun. Ekow Eshun, who is a writer and curator, who notably curated this really acclaimed exhibition called In the Black Fantastic at the Hayward Gallery, and other ones such as The Time Is Always Now at the National Portrait Gallery, which was a major study of black figure and its representation in contemporary art. He is the author of books including Black Gold of the Sun, Africa's State of Mind, and The Stranger, 5 Extraordinary Black Men, and The World That Made Them. He was notably described by Vogue as the most inspired and inspiring curator in Britain, and will now talk to us about his research about this really interesting concept that he coined, the Black Fantastic, which will resonate in plenty of ways and lay the ground for lots of productive discussions during our talk. I just want to say that there will be a very interesting connection with the cycle that we had last year, which was about realities of science fiction, that took the exploration of alternative realities and how fiction shaped our current understanding of the world. And somehow your work creates a very interesting bridge with the notion of science fiction, but expands it with past, futures, mythologies, speculations. And so we're really excited to have you with us here to lay down this work. Thank you so much, Ekow, for being with us.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's a Saturday afternoon. Thank you all to the other speakers earlier today, because I've been really enjoying them. I thought I'd stand. It seems easier to talk, seems easier to see everyone in one place. As Martin was saying, I curated an exhibition a couple of years ago at the Hayward Gallery in London called In the Black Fantastic. The exhibition explored the work of black artists who engage with myth and speculation in their work, and do so and draw inspiration from African-originated beliefs and knowledge systems, and do so as a way to address racial injustice. So the show featured artists like Nick Cave, Chicago artist whose work we can see here, and Chris Ofili, British artist whose work we can currently see here. And I want to explore some of the ideas and the territory of the Black Fantastic, using imagery from the exhibition. But first of all, let's begin a little further back in time. Let's begin in 1840. This is an image from Turner's painting, A Slave Ship, from 1840, or to give the painting its full title, Slave Ship, brackets, slavers thrown overboard, the dead and dying, typhoon coming on. As its title suggests, this is a painting that depicts a scene of horror. A ship struggles in a storm. Giant waves slam against the deck. The sky is angry and red. Savage fish bear down on struggling people. We see limbs raised in the air, arms and legs with chains still clasped upon them. This painting is based on an infamous true story, an infamous real event in 1781. The captain of a slave ship called the Zong, which was traveling from West Africa to Jamaica, was caught in a storm. And the captain of that ship, the Zong, ordered 132 enslaved people, captive people, to be thrown overboard from the ship, because after the storm, drinking water was low on the ship. So the captain threw overboard 132 people. And when he reached land, he tried to claim back the money from those people, from the insurance for goods lost at sea. He imagined these people as property to be tossed overboard and then to be claimed back. The slave ship is, or the story of the Zong, is also among the artistic source material for the work of Gallagher, a contemporary artist who has a series of paintings called Ecstatic Draft of Fishes. You see some of the works here. And where Turner's painting, Slave Ship, focuses its moral force on events taking place aboard the Zong on the surface of the sea, Ellen Gallagher goes beneath the waves. Her paintings, this series, Ecstatic Draft of Fishes, detail an underwater world where marine creatures and delicate flora are intertwined with a fable, a story, a myth of a black Atlantis, which is also intertwined with legacies of slavery and colonialism and the Middle Passage. Ellen Gallagher's work brings to mind a poem by the Nobel Prize-winning poet Derek Walcott. Walcott wrote a poem called The Sea is History. And in this poem, he imagines the seabed of the Atlantic as a burial ground for lives lost during the slave trade. Walcott writes, Exodus, bone soldered by coral to bone mosaics, mantled by the benediction of the shark's shadow. And similarly, Ellen Gallagher's paintings wrestle with the horror of the Middle Passage. I was talking to Ellen Gallagher not so long ago, earlier this year. We were talking about her work, but we ended up talking about Moby Dick, the Melville novel. And there's a scene in Moby Dick where the most humble, the least regarded character on the ship is a cabin boy called Pip. He's a black cabin boy. He's described as the most insignificant of the crew of the ship. At one point in the novel, he goes overboard, he falls overboard, and is almost drowned before he's rescued. And his submersion in the water changes him entirely. Melville writes in Moby Dick that Pip is carried down alive to wondrous depths where strange shapes of the unwarped primal world glided to and fro before his passive eyes. Pip saw the multitudinous, God omnipresent coral insects. He saw God's foot upon the treadle of the loom and spoke it. And therefore, his shipmates called him mad. What does Pip see in the unwarped primal world? Perhaps he has cause to contemplate the burial grounds of bones that Derek Walcott talks of. Or perhaps he saw more or further than his shipmates on board the ship. Perhaps his madness, so-called, was an altered consciousness, an understanding of the water as a further realm, a realm of memory and mourning and revelation. And similarly, for Ellen Gallagher, going beneath the waves offers a glimpse beyond. of the sea are the space in which to imagine new configurations of black life and resistance. On the seafloor, amid seashells and corals and the memory of the shackled and the drowned, we find these elegant, alien female creatures. Their appearance is modelled by Ellen Gallagher on sculpted figurines from 17th century Central African artworks. And the presence of these figures also references the oceanic myth created by Drexciya, who were an enigmatic Detroit techno group in the 1990s. Drexciya, the group, imagined an underwater realm, also called Drexciya, populated by the descendants of pregnant African people thrown aboard from slave ships like the Zong. In the Drexciya myth, the children of those pregnant African women learn to breathe underwater. They create their own civilization. They might look like these figures in Ella Gallagher's paintings. Glorious proof, that is, of how black life might have flourished in Africa, under the sea, in the Atlantic, without the depredations of slavery. Now, this synthesis of historical fact, lyrical fiction, that we see in Ellen Gallagher's work here is indicative of a turn to the speculative and the mythic in the work of a whole range of black artists, from Wangechi Mutu to Chris Ofili to Hugh Locke and other figures. And these were the artists that I brought together in my show at the Hayward, in the Black Fantastic. And in all their work, we see a similar merging of fable and myth, history and speculation, the spiritual and the science fictional. This was the subject of my exhibition. And I started exploring this territory because I noticed it as a tendency, as a turning point in art, and also beyond visual art, in other areas, in pop culture, from Black Panther to Beyoncé. It led me to start to speak of this concept, this term I coined, the Black Fantastic. And by the Black Fantastic, I mean works of speculative fiction that draw from history and myth to conjure new visions of African diasporic culture, identity, possibility. And here I reference the work of the scholar Rosemary Jackson, whose description of the fantastic is as a form that reaches beyond the boundaries of realism and dispenses with rigid distinctions between animate and inanimate objects, self and other, life and death. The fantastic, says Jackson, undoes and reconfigures the cultural order of society and represents the unspoken desire for change. It involves inverting elements of this world, recombining the constitutive features in new relations to produce something strange, unfamiliar, and new. And to this definition, we can add that the Black Fantastic begins from an understanding of race as a socially constructed fiction rather than a scientific truth, albeit fiction that we all live within, which is simply to say that race is an idea rather than a fact. Race is an idea and a fact, and a lived fact. But the Black Fantastic also operates with a skepticism about Western narratives of progress and modernity, which were first developed during the Enlightenment, during the 18th century, in which rationality, order, progress, civilization were conceived as Western tropes, Western principles. And anything beyond that was considered uncivilized. So the Enlightenment was balanced on a binary between the civilized and the primitive, the modern and the traditional, the scientific and the superstitious. We can hear this in the words of some of the great Enlightenment philosophers of that period. Hegel wrote, "In Negro life, consciousness has not yet attained to the realization of any substantial, objective existence." African people, he said, were representative of natural man in his completely wild and untamed state. Immanuel Kant wrote that the Negro can be disciplined and cultivated, but is never genuinely civilized. He falls of his own accord into savagery. And this legacy of fantastic othering persists in the ways black people are dehumanized and demonized to this day. We can think in American terms, for instance, of legacies of lynchings and racialized beatings, Rodney King, George Floyd, most recently. So this is the thing. So for black people, this is the question. Well, or for black people, this is the condition. Our reality means living within a white fantasy of our brutishness, our primitiveness. And the question comes, how should we live? How can we survive? How can we walk in this world under these conditions? What do we do? Perhaps the answer might come by us choosing to conjure our own fantasies, our own fictions, not as a means of escape or retreat, but as a way to grapple with the horror of the ordinary racialized everyday. This is something that Toni Morrison, the great novelist, talked of in writing her classic work, Beloved. Toni Morrison talked about how she wanted to explore the texture of black life while not falling into the conventions of racialized thinking with its hierarchies of white superiority and black brutishness. She said she sought not to reinforce already established reality, but to occupy a space of strange and compelling imagining, rich with unique metaphorical and imagistic associations, that was historically true in essence, but not strictly factual. If we think about Beloved as a novel, this is based on a true story. But Morrison turns real events into a ghost story that speaks of history, memory, pain, and possibility. Sorrow and pain become the means to speak of resistance, to see beyond into expansiveness and dreaming. This is what was behind the myth of Drexciya, as conceived by Ellen Gallagher. And this is the same impulse that's in play, in fact, in another water-based myth, which is known as the legend of the flying Africans. So let's return to the water once again. In May 1803, a slave ship is bound for St. Simon's Island off the coast of the 75 captive men and women on board, who are from the Igbo region in present-day Nigeria, stage a revolt. And he managed to overturn the crew on the ship, take control of the vessel. The white crew jump overboard. But they now have control of the vessel, but the vessel runs aground on the coast of Georgia. And now the Igbo people are faced with a choice. They're faced with the prospect of being captured on the coast of Georgia and returned to captivity, returned to slavery. And they choose to do something else instead. They're still in their chains and they choose to walk into the water together and drown as an act of resistance. It's the true story and variations on the story of these Africans who find liberation through suicide, have been told over successive generations ever since then, across the Atlantic world, from America to South America to the Caribbean. And in that process, this true story has taken on the shape of myth. It is said in many versions of this story that the Africans did not simply walk into the sea and drown. They walked into the sea and then soared into the air and flew home across the Atlantic. The legend of the flying Africans, as it's become known, has been reimagined many times as folklore, but also as the basis for all kinds of creative works, from Toni Morrison's novel, Song of Solomon, to the Julie Dash film, Daughters of the Dust, to Lemonade by Beyoncé. And in these fictional works, the boundary between the past and the present, the everyday world, and the realm of the imaginary and the spirit and the mythic is always on the verge of dissolving and giving way. All of this is the territory of the Black Fantastic. In works from creative figures across the African diaspora, we see a shared tendency to elide myth and collective memory, speculative and supernatural and science fictional. One question is why? Why now for the Black Fantastic? Especially why now in the context of the evidence and the experience of brutality that we can see all around us, most recently captured in the experience of George Floyd and other figures. Why now for the fictional worlds of the Black Fantastic? I'd argue that the fantastical is not to do with an escape, a retreat. On the contrary, it suggests a refusal to live within the constraints of a society that defines Black people as inferior and alien. It offers a means to scrutinize, to critique, and then to reach beyond the everyday. Let's look at some artworks. So, in 1991, the Chicago-based artist Nick Cave was watching TV, and he watched the brutal beating of a Black motorist called Rodney King, who was beaten almost to death by 5 white policemen. These white policemen were tried in court, where they described Rodney King, who was a defenseless man. They described him as bear-like. They said he had superhuman strength. He was like a wounded animal, like a mean dog, they said. They described him as completely brutal, in other words. Nick Cave's response was to create these works that he called sound suits. And he's made, since he first started, since 1991, he's made over 500 of these. So the sound suits are part sculpture, part costume, part armor. You can wear them. They're made from all sorts of things: beaded necklaces, embroidered flowers, stuffed animals, vintage toys, ceramic figures. They're bright colors and elaborately decorated surfaces. are a form of resistance to conventional registers of racial identity. They transform the body, altering heights and proportions, and turning away the racialized gaze and offering instead this patterned fantasia. But the liveliness, the dynamism of Cave's creations doesn't imply a retreat from race. It's a resistance to Western binaries of blackness as brute, as whiteness as civilization, instead of black or white, we're in this realm of color, pattern, display, self-assertion. Something else that we see in the work of British Guyanese artist Hugh Locke. These two figures that we see on horseback are part of a series that Hugh Locke did called The Ambassadors, which is shown in my exhibition in the Black Fantastic. The ambassadors are figures on horseback. They seem to be figures that might be ambassadors of regality and ceremony, but they're covered in strange regalia, colonial medals, slave pennies, Benin bronzes, portraits of Toussaint Louverture. The potential origins of these figures means they might be lords, but they might be bandits. Locke grew up in Guyana, and we might think about these creatures as steeped in the history and heritage of masquerade, the spirit of misrule that comes out from carnival in the Caribbean. They become they become also then a way of exploring how the black figure has been presented historically in art. If we look closer at the ambassadors, we see all sorts of art historical references that Hugh Locke has embedded into the surface of their regalia. We can see how in looking at this work, for instance, when we look closer, we see, if you look down at the bottom there, you can see just this hanging figure. A hanging figure that, in fact, references William Blake's painting of an enslaved person suspended near death in the plantations in the Caribbean. William Blake drawing a Negro hung alive by the ribs to a gallows. All of these then, so the ambassadors becomes a way of thinking historically into the present and via speculation. When I showed Ellen Gallagher's ecstatic draft of Fisher's paintings, which I was talking about earlier, and I showed them as part of the exhibition, we paired them with a painting by a 16th century Dutch artist called Albert Ekow. We can see her paintings here, and we can see the Ekow painting just at the end of the gallery space. Oops. The Ekow painting was called Zwart's Man with Spear. It was supposed to be a depiction of a black man in Brazil, but it was based, in fact, entirely on a fantasy of what such a figure might have looked like. It's historically inaccurate, but it's presented as an accurate version. In other words, it was another white fantasy of blackness that was in play. And the juxtaposition of Ellen's work and this work by Ekow was an attempt by Ellen Gallagher to think about the links between colonialism, slavery, and depictions of blackness in art history. In all of these artworks, Nick Cave, Ellen Gallagher, Hugh Locke, all of these artworks speak of a way of navigating in the world, of imagining into the world, that also brings to mind what the American poet Elizabeth Alexander has called a metaphysical space beyond the black public everyday, a space governed by the power and wild imagination that black people ourselves know we possess. ultimately, when we look at these works, I'd suggest we might best understand the Black Fantastic not as a, not as a movement, not as a rigid category, but perhaps a way of seeing, a way of being, a way of walking in the world, of conjuring worlds that make sense of the fraught experience of the racialized everyday by embracing fantasy as a zone of creative and cultural liberation. When I made this show, I called it In the Black Fantastic. In suggests the Black Fantastic not as a passive, but an active condition, a space to explore, a terrain to occupy. This was the intention of the show as a physical experience, as a world to find yourself within. I wanted, and what I continue to want with the Black Fantastic, to invite a sharing of a view, of a perspective, of a way of seeing. Black dreaming, Black possibility, a reaching beyond, a state of being, a way of seeing. The Black Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, the only word that comes to the mind is fantastic, of course. I didn't prepare that one, it really comes up, I swear. Are there any questions, comments? On peut prendre les questions en français, les traduire aussi. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions que vous avez envie de poser? Parce que c'est quand même une belle occasion que vous avez d'avoir ces personnes qui viennent. Natalia.
Thank you very much for this absolutely captivating presentation. Have never seen a curator presenting their work this way. Maybe that's what should be done, more of that. I remember you were talking about Zong, and the first time I encountered this story, I was absolutely petrified, horrified, and enchanted at the same time by the work of North Sea Phillips, Canadian poet, from 2008, and the book is called Zong, and it is a book about death, about rhythm of death, a book which is a catalogue, a book which is a concrete poem. And I was wondering whether you think it relates to the exhibition, or it doesn't relate to the exhibition, or maybe there's a way of including it in your perspective, or there is a reason for excluding it. So that's more of a comment rather than a question.
I mean, I'll stand again. Yeah, well, I mean, thank you. Yeah, I mean, thank you. I didn't reference that for the show, not for any particular reason. When I did the show, in fact, I had a number of quotes from different writers that I used, that I put on text on some of the walls, again, to invite us into the space and to be able to share perspectives from a number of different people. She wasn't one of them, not for any reason, but one of the things that I became aware of was that this idea that I had, the Black Fantastic, it doesn't stop with me. In a way, it's a way, I realize it's a way of describing what so many different figures have been trying to explore. Like, how is it that Black experience often feels uncanny? The experience of being on the Zong is nightmarish, but what we take away from it is both that historical nightmare and then the realization, the capacity of at least some people to treat others with that depth of inhumanity. Then raises the question about, well, what is human experience? How do we relate to each other, experience each other, see inside others' heads? And in a way, then, one of the absolutely legitimate responses to that is through works of fiction or works of speculation that allow us, works of poetry, that allow us to see beyond the official record. Because, as to finish, the story of the Zong comes to us through the documents of the ship, of the court case, of the insurance records. So to get further than that, we have to imagine into that space. So that's where her work comes in, that's where Gallagher comes in, that's where a whole range of other works come in. The speculative becomes a way into, if you want, the soul of the story, beyond the dry record. We realize what is missing in that is the humanity of those people who were lost. So yeah, it's a good question, and there are many further iterations of this space.
Thank you so much. On peut encore prendre quelques questions. Vas-y, les suivantes.
Oui, merci beaucoup. C'était vraiment très, très intéressant. Et en fait, j'ai pas vraiment une question. C'est cette histoire des esclaves qui forment une sorte de nouvelle communauté sous la mer. Ça me fait penser à l'époque actuelle où c'est plus l'Atlantique qui est le cimetière des Africains, mais c'est la Méditerranée. Et c'est très, très actuel en ce moment. La Méditerranée est vraiment le cimetière de tous les migrants subsahariens, en grande partie subsahariens, qui remontent à travers le désert, à travers la Libye, qui s'embarquent sur
pas trop long, parce que je dois
voilà.
traduire.
Donc voilà. Donc c'était une réflexion là-dessus, sur la contextualisation.
So it wasn't a question, it was more about a comment about the fact that this story that you're talking about of the slave horrendously being thrown over and living under the sea kinds of echoes the situation today of the graves of the Mediterranean becoming this contemporary grave for various migrants that are trying to cross.
I mean, exactly that. And what happens in Britain, at least anyway, is that these present-day stories, you know, the government, they talk about stopping the boats, stopping the invasion, all of these things, never about the people, never about those individuals, never about who it is that might be traveling and why. And so, again, we come to this thing. How do we get beyond those ways of othering? How do we get closer? The exercise of the imagination, in fact, has the potential to take us closer to each other.
Thank you. I think what is really strong with your presentation is that you show how speculation, myth, ways of opening up, you know, like narratives, is not a form of escapism by no means. You know, like there is this very strong position that you take.
Every successful story of any kind is something that expands our individual and human consciousness and closeness. This is what we respond to in a story. And all of these visual stories, I realized artists are extraordinary people sometimes because they can tell rich, complex stories without any words. They can take us into other worlds with an image. And all I've been doing is trying to follow this course. Sorry, we've got another question.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question related to in the Black Fantastic, obviously, has so many ideas and thoughts and artistic practices are being represented. I wonder if you're working already on continuing some of these ideas. Which ideas are you taking from the existing exhibition, and what kind of forms or shapes a continuation might take, which might not be necessarily an exhibition per se, but other forms? And also, I was fascinated by the story, the myth of the flying Africans who ran aground in Georgia. I wonder, in the transmutation of this story from popular culture to artistic practices, what other stories are you looking at the moment, which might be as strong and powerful as this? Like, what other stories that are lesser known somehow to the general public?
I mean, the first part. So yes, with the Black Fantastic, it still remains something that I feel has got lots more to go. So we started with exhibition. I did a book version of that, which allowed me then to go much, much further. So the book has 300 images, crosses not just art, but also music, architecture, cinema, and so on. Right now, I'm making a film. Right now, I'm making a documentary film based on the ideas and imagery that we've been exploring. So the film includes lots of interviews and conversations with a range of artists like Gallagher and Wangechi Mutu. But also, to come to the second part of your question, we've also been shooting, as well as the conversations with artists, we've also been shooting these expansive, dreamlike sequences of our own. I've been working with, in fact, actually, you might, because he's coming here, Julian Knox. So I've been working with Julian Knox, who's a great poet, artist, filmmaker. So we've been shooting in Ghana for the last few weeks. Shooting these, I like to think, these slightly extraordinary scenes. And in a way, to come to the second part of your question, we've been trying to draw on some existing myths, stories, but the goal is to think about, how do you retell? How do you imagine further fable? How do you take, things like the Flying Africans? We've got a scene with a giant tortoise at one point. It's a giant tortoise with a jeweled back. The tortoise plays this role and it's become a kind of interesting figure in the film. Point is, we're trying to create our own imaginaries, our own mythic sequences, our own iterations of the fantastic. So in the same way that the story of the Flying Africans changes shape with each telling, we want to take elements of African performance, culture, masquerade, histories, and give them a new dimension so that they're both related and then unrelated to their origins. So they take their own shape, so they take their own fictive form as invocations of the Black Fantastic. So that's where we are. We're trying to make this film. We're trying to make the fantastic. We're trying to take it into yet another form.
That's a beautiful and wonderful program. Thank you, Ekow, for this lecture / slam poetry. Thank you so much.